김대중 100년 평화페스티벌 오후 세션을 시작하도록 하겠습니다. 오늘 첫 번째 특별 강연은 미국, 중국, 러시아의 대결과 세계 평화의 길이라는 주제로 열립니다.
Professor
그럼
Oliver
첫
Richmond,
번째 강연의
and he'll be
좌장을
speaking under the title of Navigating the
백학순
Confrontation Among the
원장님과
US, China,
강연을
Russia,
진행해 주실
Exploring
맨체스터
Pathways to
대학교
Global
올리버
Peace.
리치몬드
The session will be
교수님을
moderated
모시겠습니다.
by
큰 박수로
Dr.
환영해 주시기
Park-sun
바랍니다.
of the Kim Dae-jung Academy. So please welcome both the moderator and the speaker to the stage with a big applause.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the first special speech session of this very historic event, Peace Festival, celebrating the centennial of the birth of President Kim Dae-jung. This session will be dealing with peace in a transitional international order, navigating confrontations among the US, China, and Russia by exploring pathways to global peace. We've invited Dr. Oliver Richmond, Professor of Politics at the University of Manchester, UK, as the speaker for this session. Oliver, it's always more difficult to travel eastward than travel westward. So you flew to Korea from London, flying eastward, and I hope you will not be too much jet-lagged at the moment. You okay?
Yes, I'm okay. I've had a good sleep.
I think he has already overcome much of the jet lag. And let me introduce Professor Oliver Richmond. We are truly honored to have you for this session. And Professor Oliver Richmond is a world-renowned, prominent scholar in the field of international relations, peace and conflict studies. He received an Eminent Scholar Award from the International Studies Association, which is a community of scholars dedicated to international studies worldwide. He has worked with many international actors, especially with the United Nations and the civil society organizations around the world, and also conducted many studies on peace building and peacekeeping and peace of Timor-Leste, East Timor formerly, and Sri Lanka, Cyprus, Bosnia, Kosovo, and Colombia. This means that he's basically covering, and he studied the whole world in an effort to understand peace and conflict resolution. He has published many important books well known to the students of international relations, theories and international politics and peace studies. The Grand Design, Peace in the 21st Century, and Peace in International Relations, Peace Formation and Political Order in Conflict-Affected Society, and Failed State Building, Intervention and State and Dynamics of Peace Formation, and a very short introduction to peace. All these works are very well known to the scholars who are studying in this area, and again, I appreciate your participation out of your busy schedule. I originally intended to introduce more details about him, but because time is running out, let me just stop there. And so let me have some housework for how to manage this. Actually, about 50 minutes are left for this session. So, Oliver, you can speak probably 30 to 35 minutes. If you want to speak, just here, or if you want to go to the podium, and as you please. And after that, we will have maybe 10 to 15 minutes of question and answer period. After that, I will wrap it up. Thank you so much, Oliver, again, for coming here. Please.
Well, good afternoon. I hope everyone's had a nice lunch and is ready to listen to some complex and convoluted theoretical propositions about peace. I'll do my best to keep it as simple as possible. It's a great honor for me to do this presentation and to be here. Thank you very much to the Center and the Foundation for inviting me. And I'm going to take the opportunity to talk about the evolution of peace as a concept and a practice, and what this means in the contemporary transitional international order. I start with quite a famous painting, just to show that peace is something which has long been on our minds, both in academia, in the arts, across cultures and societies, and of course in statecraft and in international politics. This is a painting by Lorenzetti, kind of early Enlightenment depiction of what peace means. It's in Siena, a beautiful town in Tuscany, a fresco on a wall in a building there. And what we see from this painting is a very pleasant-looking Italian city, a Renaissance city, which is in great shape, is developing, there are happy people, and daily life is being lived in a very pleasant way. On the other hand, and this one is not quite so clear because it's damaged, Lorenzetti also gave us another version of the same painting. This one shows the same city which has been affected by war. This is a city in which you can see death and the dying in the streets and the destruction of the built environment. What's happening in these two paintings is indicative of a very long-standing debate in societies, in politics, and in academia about the nature of peace, its evolution, and how this links to political orders, whether local political orders at state level or at the international level. And in the previous painting, we see what Lorenzetti describes as the effects of good government on a city: prosperity, happiness, public buildings, institutions, orderliness, cleanliness, progress. And in this painting, we see the effects of bad government on a city. So this is, if you like, the extension of a very long global debate about how you make peace and how peace links to political order. And the fulcrum of that debate is about government. How does one govern the world? How does one govern the state and local communities in ways which prevent the morbidities of war from taking over and destroying progress? So what is a better or best form of government for peace to occur? And I think this is a debate which takes us all the way through political philosophy, history, political theory, and practice. You know, a long time ago, Cicero said that war is a pretty easy thing to make. Peace is very difficult because of its complexity. So what does that mean for us today in this transitional international order? Well, since the end of World War II and through most of the 20th century, we saw the consolidation of the political philosophy of liberalism and the idea of liberal peace, a sort of Kantian, Lockean idea, that peace comes through democracy, rights, hospitality to strangers, and trade, which lead to prosperity, economic and technological advancement, and constitutional design. That is, the state designs legal frameworks to govern these morbidities that lead to violence and war, to remove them from the public sphere, and to create space and platforms for conversations, discussions, contact, debates, discourse, law, and advancement in a range of areas, from the arts to the science and technology. And I think you'll be thinking to yourselves, well, this reflects very much what we've been hearing this morning in this centennial celebration of the life of your former president and Nobel laureate. So this was the liberal moment, if you like. It was based on these theories about democratic peace and a kind of idea that democracies don't tend to fight each other because citizens realize that they bear the brunt of war, but also that democracies tend to build international institutions in order to advance the conditions in which people live globally, as well as to prevent war and to deal with global challenges. So all of this said, one would expect that through the 20th century and by the end of the Cold War, this so-called liberal international order would have seen great successes in bringing to an end conflicts around the world. And I think on balance, it did. You know, from South Africa through to many conflicts in sub-Saharan Africa, although many remain outstanding, Cambodia, Timor-Leste, Northern Ireland, Bosnia, Kosovo, Colombia, and so on, many peace processes and settlements have been designed around this liberal logic that one needs to address the constitutional framework of a state, to check and balance power, to give the people a voice in order for them to be able to choose and express their political objectives, in order to navigate around systems of hierarchy, privilege, violence, discrimination, inequality, and unsustainability. You know, we saw major advances around the world after 1990. Many conflicts became more open to contact and discourse and settlement. However, many of them also got stuck in stalemates, which involved signed agreements, but limited implementation of those peace agreements. And I think probably the most infamous of those currently points us to the Minsk agreements in the Ukraine conflict, agreements which were made but never implemented and led to the current war. The lack of implementation led to the current war. Of course, we must also note that this liberal international order was very much centered upon the interests of the global north. And behind that were the experiences of colonialism, imperialism, the Industrial Revolution, and global inequality, its consolidation, and the inability to address deep-seated injustices and inequalities in that historical period. And yet, I think it's probably true to say that for the first time in human history, giant steps were being made all around the world, not least, as we heard earlier, in South Africa. And yet, the liberal peace of the last 80 years was very firmly based on two key American victories, one in World War II and the other in the Cold War, one military and the other ideological. So underpinning this liberal international order and the liberal peace was a kind of modernized understanding of a victor's peace. There are many moments in that historical evolution where the subjects, the recipients of peacemaking, whether it was Germany and Japan, Italy, or whether it was later during those Cold War conflicts, for example, here in the Korean Peninsula, in Vietnam, and then later in those post-Cold War peace settlements from Cambodia to Colombia and onwards to Ukraine, where the parameters of the peace settlement was designed before negotiations or mediation ever took place. So what the liberal peace did was it gave us a sense of how peace would be made, what its parameters would be, and really conflict disputants around the world were just more or less expected to internalize that system and to sign up to it. Now this created a kind of ideological and political vacuum which we're seeing at play now in this transitional international order. We're seeing that it has led to resurgent challenges against the liberal international order. Some of them may be post-liberal in the sense that they point to new developments, innovations in peacemaking, improvements, more justice and equity in that system, more sustainability. But others point backwards to that 19th century world of imperialism, balance of power politics, states-based political interests, and so on and so forth. I think the one key point to keep in mind about this liberal peace era that we've experienced so recently has been the flowering across so many disciplinary areas, from technology to the arts, in society, global social networks, civil society, advocacy, rights, and law. The liberal peace was a platform for enormous improvements, not least in development settings. And yet, we're faced now with a whole series of problems in the liberal international order. It's seen to be not representative enough. It seems to be not fair enough, not to be concerned with justice enough. And so we're seeing a competitor system emerge. And this competitor system we can call the authoritarian international order. Now this is a bit black and white. I'm not saying that there is a direct competition, intellectual and policy competition between the liberal international order and the authoritarian international order. But just for the sake of argument, I think it's useful to look at this alternative. So an authoritarian international order, as opposed to the liberal international order, validates centralized power, authoritarianism, territorial exclusion, social hierarchy. It has common ground with the liberal international order in its interest in technological, scientific, and economic systems. But there are acute differences when it comes to questions of justice, distributive justice, that is equality, historical justice, that is dealing with historic violence, historic injustices, and finding ways for restitution in those cases. It doesn't have the same interest in global cooperation. It divides the globe up into regional blocks and sees these regional blocks as locked-in competition, whether territorial resource or technology or military competitions. Now, the net result of the advent of this authoritarian international order has been to challenge and begin to break down the hegemony, the dominance of the liberal international order. And this has had a knock-on effect in many peace processes around the world. A common pattern I think we've seen in many peace processes, particularly over the last 20 years since 9/11, the war on terror, has been that agreements are signed but not implemented, that rights ambitions for those agreements are watered down, that ambitions for development and for dealing with questions of inequality are sidestepped, and that wider questions of justice and sustainability are rejected. And both the liberal international order, the UN system, the development system, the international humanitarian system, and the global network of NGOs has been pushed back, has watered down its claims for peacemaking, and the authoritarian international order has begun to step up its challenge to many of those components. So we're seeing a kind of retrenchment in this great power transition in international order, and I think this has had a major impact on the potential for peacemaking. As opposed to the dynamism and the potential that we heard about this morning, for which your former president was awarded the Nobel Prize, what we're seeing now is a closing down of the space for civil society, for state reform, and for international institutionalization, whether that's economic, technological, trade, rights, or international law-based. And this is having a big impact on one of the major findings of scholarship in this field over the last 30 or so years, from the work of scholars like Jean-Paul Liederac to a newer generation of scholars like myself. There has been a strong consensus that the peacemaking processes, peace building and development processes, since that early post-war period and right through to the post-Cold War period, were not locally owned, were not contextually sensitized, were not closely connected with justice, but tended to be connected with power and victory, and therefore were not able to capitalize on the platform the liberal international order provided. As peacemaking became more and more localized and contextualized and more inclusive, it also was perhaps less and less able to deal with some of these big, great power contests, the ideological contests that we saw happening and we see happening again. So we've seen, for example, President Modi's retrenchment, Prime Minister Modi's retrenchment in India in the context of Kashmir. We've seen the way in which President Putin of Russia has used the Ukraine war to consolidate a preference for geopolitical balance of power politics over human rights and democracy. We've seen acute internal divisions over the current Gaza war, and also arguments about the hypocrisy of the West and the East vis-à-vis their contrasting positions on both Ukraine and that war. Many of these claims of hypocrisy have been directed at the West and the global North, and many of them point to US conduct in the Iraq war, perhaps even behind that conduct in the much earlier Vietnam War. And what this means, I think, for this major advance in peacemaking and peace building, which is to shift it into more localized contexts, more humane contexts, is that those doors are closed. And peace is shifted away from these great questions of civil society and government, how we are governed, and how different layers of government from the local, the state, and the international deal with our global problems. And we end up with a very crude version of peace in this authoritarian international order, the putative international order that seems to be emerging. One which is connected to For example, in the case of Russia's dealings with Syria and President Assad, his geopolitical preferences, his readings of domestic power relations, and a tendency for peace to be made by siding with power, by siding with the most powerful actors in a conflict. So this is a reiteration of the victor's peace, if you like. And it's dragging us away from the scholarship and the science and much of the policy work that was done that was trying to create a more contractual form of peace, which connected ordinary people in their daily and everyday lives with the practices of politics at the state and the international level. We can see this, I'll move on, in the context of the great powers of the day and their various responses to the growth of conflicts, the numbers of conflicts which have expanded enormously in the last 10 or 15 years. And they are thinking about peacemaking, but they're not thinking about it in the way in which the liberal international order thought about it, in terms of rights and democracy, development and the rule of law, and so on. So, for example, President Xi of China, looking at the war in Ukraine and the opposition between the West and Russia and some in the global South too, amongst the BRICS states, for example, has come up with some new rules, which are essentially rules for peacemaking. Now, peacemaking is being translated into neutrality. This is quite different to a human rights approach, which sides with the conflict-affected subject and wants that subject to be validated, heard, authorized, and have their political claims be dealt with. He says there are three principles, really, of neutrality for peacemaking in this new world order, this authoritarian international order. No spillover from the battlefield, no escalation in fighting, and no adding oil to the fire by relevant parties or interested parties. This takes us back to the 19th century again. This is containment strategies in which you throw a cordon sanitaire around conflicts. You try to prevent them from escaping, but you don't deal with the deep-rooted conflict issues of the particular conflict. So I see this as a major step back from liberal peace building, liberal peacemaking, the liberal international order, and the liberal peace in general. So we have a number of different possibilities then for thinking about how to get beyond this contest between the liberal international order and an authoritarian international order that seems to be developing. You know, we have the lesson of the European Union, one which has been drawn and learnt from around the world. Attempts to regionalize, to build regional systems below the UN system. The UN can delegate, regional organizations can feed up to help in the government of the world in ways which are more peaceful. And don't forget, the point of peacemaking, ultimately, is to remove violence from political practice. So the utility of violence is no longer a tool in politics. And instead you have discourse, contact, unpacking power relations and hierarchies and finding ways to deal with them, ways which connect with global justice. And I think there are a lot of spaces here for what we can call emancipatory developments in peacemaking. So you have that regionalization aspect. You also have the alternative formulations of interest groups around the world. For example, the BRICS. Although we wonder which way the BRICS are going, some seem to be shifting towards the AIO, the authoritarian international order. Others are staying in the LIO, and some are stepping outside of both, looking for alternative forms of international order. And again, across these debates, there are contestations about rights, democracy, law, development, justice, and its integral nature for peace, or whether or not peace just revolves around neutrality, but war is a reserve function of states and regional blocs. So I think a key question here for us, as scholars, policymakers, practitioners, and so on, is to think about how we shift peace in the future away from its connection to victor's peace, which has been its longest standing historical practice, and more towards what Lorenzetti depicted in this artwork that I showed earlier. I think he was thinking about justice. And in the first painting in particular, about the effects of good government, you could see the many different aspects of justice, from society to public infrastructure, across the arts, and so on. Today we'll be talking about global justice. So peace with global justice, which would mean unpacking historical injustices in order to make a peace settlement stick. It would mean dealing with distributive questions. That means closing inequality gaps in societies and across the world, a global problem, a global project. And it would also mean dealing with global gender inequalities. It would mean dealing with questions of environmental unsustainability, which feeds into the international political economy that we currently operate under. Remember, I said this is the one common area between the LIO and the AIO. They agree on the global political economy. Many critical policy advocates and scholars disagree on the nature of the global political economy, while agreeing on the need for the other forms of justice. So I think we're starting to see a third position emerging, outside of the liberal international order, outside of this putative authoritarian international order. Many of the new developments that we see coming from, for example, China and Russia, where they claim to be redefining peacekeeping and mediation, are actually regressions. They take us back to older systems of peacekeeping and mediation, as well as development. We've had some new developments from the Gulf states, Qatar, Dubai, and so on, and also from countries like Turkey, which are kind of straddling the East and the West, thinking about new forms of diplomacy, multi-mediation, complex forms of mediation for dealing with conflicts, which means activating civil, social, state, and international actors at the same time to deal with conflicts such as the ongoing conflict over Ukraine. The alternatives that are being offered in the authoritarian international order favor authoritarianism, autocracy, conceptions of the state system related to historical territorial claims, non-intervention, but reserved rights of intervention where key interests are displayed. And there's a lack of concern about human rights abuses. So we can see some positive alternatives and new developments on the policy table, and we can also see some negative alternatives and developments. If we look in more detail at the authoritarian international order's proposed conflict management system, it's based mostly on a rejection of the liberal peace, the liberal international order, and liberal peace-building systems that have been emerging over the last decades. So it takes the international order back. What comes after the liberal international order, it takes us back in many ways to the 19th century. Regional blocs, balance of power, and a disinterest in the ordinary everyday experience of peace. It takes us back to the victor's peace, territorial spoils, economic power, and global hierarchy. It undermines civil and social movements, undermines the everyday peace. And yet, despite those things, it seems to have some attractions in the global south. Much of that attraction, I think, has been related to uncertainty in the west and the global north, and the various hypocrisies that we've seen in the way in which the global north has dealt with ongoing conflicts, and legacy issues, particularly colonialism, the anti-colonial movements, the post-independence colonial states, and so on. So there's a lot here to unpack and develop and deal with. We have a lot on our plate. I think that the attraction for the authoritarian international order in the global south is very problematic, and it's mainly for political elites, economic, social, and political elites, who see the state system as a way of facilitating the existing global political economy. And I think that's very problematic for peace. Peace and its evolution is challenging those systems. So there's a very concerted pushback. Now, I don't know whether you can see that there. Okay, you can, good. So the AIO is compressing the liberal international order. It's expanding geopolitical interests. It's marginalizing these critical scientific and social movements. It's preventing our capacity to reform the state system and to reform the international political economy. It blocks peace with justice. And this is, I think, the key dividing line of the current era. Do we stick with a victor's peace, or do we move away from the liberal peace into much more sophisticated understandings in our now very complex, networked, and mobile world of peace with justice? And this would mean we're thinking about peace in intergenerational terms. We're thinking about peace not just in east-west terms, but in north-south terms. We're thinking about reserved areas where peace couldn't touch in the past, that is militarism and the political economy, as being open now to scientific, social, and policy interrogation. These would be major steps. And this means that we need to rethink our critical approaches to peace now. Sorry, there's a lot of text there. It's far too much for you to read, but I'll just summarize it very quickly. Can we bridge the liberal international order with an authoritarian international order? I don't think we can. The differences are far too extreme. The difference of basing rights on liberalism and democracy, or on centralized power and geopolitical interests, are at other ends of the spectrum. It may be possible that we can move closer to the center, but the fulcrum of that would be the liberal international order, and that has been quite discredited over the last 20 or 30 years. So that means that our critical thinking about peace has no choice but to take on these big questions of justice, intergenerational, gender, environmental, distributive, historical forms of justice. So peace has to be connected with forms of emancipation. And I think, this is quite close to the kind of peace agenda that we saw here being attempted by Kim Dae-jung, and is being celebrated today as well. So what that means is we need to think about how we improve the liberal international order, how we push back against the authoritarian international order, and how we take the opportunity to follow the science of peacemaking, which is now more developed, advanced, complex, and detailed, and datified than it ever has been before. And I think there's a lot of low-hanging fruit there, ranging from these political economy questions, these questions of militarism and reserve violence, and the ways in which we will replace these tools of violence that still have political utility with peaceful tools for transition and political change and reform, connecting peace with justice. Now, the complexity of peace agency in the 21st century is like nothing we've ever seen before. And we heard a bit about that this morning from our speech on South Africa. But this complexity, the social, the cultural, the arts, the technological, the political, and the institutional complexity, its global entanglement, its mobilities, the way it travels across generations, its concern with sustainability as well. These are very important dynamics. And all of the old peace apparatus that we have, whether it's mediation, peacekeeping, constitutional agreements, institutionalization, like the UN system or the development system, are woefully inadequate to deal with the complexities of contemporary conflict. And they do not reach the potential that the scholarship suggests that we have. So I'll move to a conclusion here. You will possibly have heard in this period of acute anxiety and pressure in the international system that the UN held a Summit of the Future, grandiosely named, in New York in September around the General Assembly. And this Summit of the Future was very interesting. It was an attempt by the UN to get a grip on these debates about peace, to stop them from sliding away in the direction of the authoritarian international order, and to bring them back towards the science and the scholarship, and to make sure that these international representatives in the UN system were aware of the possibilities and the needs of peacemaking in this point in the 21st century. These are the terms that came out, were being discussed in the summit, and many of them are very familiar. They are a reiteration of the terms of Boutros Ghali's Agenda for Peace, of the later agendas for democratization and development, of R2P, and of a lot of the thinking that was coming out of the UN system in the 1990s into the 2000s. And what we see behind the words, though, is a motif of the intensification, the deepening, and the broadening of peacemaking, the modernization of peacemaking, and how it connects to the need for international reform, as well as global social representation. So this debate was being had around the General Assembly just as the Security Council is deadlocked, and the great powers, China, Russia, and the US in particular, were unable to agree any reform for the Security Council, were unable to agree on Ukraine or on Gaza, and of course on any of the other conflicts, whether it's Sudan or DRC Congo, and so on. But what this tells us is that in doctrinal terms, the policy world and the academic world are quite close together in terms of how they're envisioning the evolution of peace for the future to deal with the new complexities of international order. Increasingly aware that a lot of the legacy institutions and systems with which we associate human rights, democracy, development, and so on, are antiquated and need to be reformed and revised, and aware of a pathway, a kind of sustainable development goal or a sustaining peace agenda pathway forwards. So there's an awful lot there, I think, which we can look at, which is quite hopeful, in which we can see that this authoritarian international order contest with the liberal international order and the transition that it seems to be suggesting may not take us into the past, but may well take us forward, because this authoritarian international order is already failing to keep the peace. In fact, it's predicated on not keeping the peace. It's predicated on revising international order. And I think if we just, to conclude, come a little bit closer to home, as we heard this morning in some of the videos, here on the Korean Peninsula, you had a lot of experience in dealing with very intense Cold War-style divisions, ideological conflicts, the damage of war and violence, recovery, restitution, division, polarization, and so on. And Enlightenment leadership was very important in trying to break that down. And in order to move beyond this conflict, your Nobel laureate president was suggesting a series of openings. And I think these are a very similar series of openings that we see in the UN Sustaining Peace Agenda, and we see in the scholarship. So there is a possibility of confluence between policy, between institutions, between knowledge production, and of course, perhaps most importantly, the social movement, civil society and social groups in conflict-affected societies. And when you get that confluence, there's the possibility of moving forward. What we see from many peace agreements, though, that they operate in terms of stuttering steps. They don't work smoothly to a final signing and a consolidation. There's a lot of back and forth. There's a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of backsliding. Then there's innovation. So it's almost like a dialectical process, if you like. So what we see, I think, here is there's been a broad rejection of stalemates over a long historical time period. There has been an attempt to overcome polarization and division, to find novel and innovative ways of working around the blockages in peacemaking on the peninsula. At the formal level, as well as at the informal, at the social level, there were attempts, and there have been attempts, to establish autonomous civil society, social and trade networks, very important, to engage with questions in education, divisive questions in education, to move beyond them, across arts and culture, to connect institutions. And while these things appear to be failing, in a sense, they're also moving forward because they're finding ways of overcoming those problems. And beyond that, we also see how necessary it was and is to contribute to regional and global institution building and the expansive and expanding parameters of global rights, global democracy, and international law. So this suggests that an important step here is to think about not just the contextual peace process, but what it's nested in. In other words, how do we revise the international order so it's not the liberal international order, and it's definitely not the authoritarian international order, but we can have a new layer in the international architecture which begins to gather the scholarship, the policy insights, the practice insights, the social networks and movements. It consolidates on past gains and the important steps that were made. It stabilizes the existing system, deals with its morbidities, its hypocrisies, and leads to a revised international system. All peace settlements, successful peace settlements, are connected to a stable constitutional and institutional international order. Now, clearly, the ones that we've had are now unstable and are contested. And that means that there is a vacuum and a gap for us to rethink peace and to rethink international order simultaneously to meet many of these very difficult challenges that we've been noting here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Oliver. You talked about the end of liberal international order and victorious peace and the advent of authoritarian international order. Listening to your argument, it feels like we are just stuck in the middle in this transitional international order. I'm sorry, because the time is so limited that I'm afraid I cannot open the floor for questions and answers. So let me ask you just one or two questions, which I thought quite important after listening to your presentation. Just caught in the two competing international order, and we have definitely have a great need to promote what is it, as you put it, emancipation and justice and the rights, expansion of rights and sustainability, gender equality, democracy, and all of that. And you even talked about the venue of the prepared United Nations, the Summit of Future in the United States, which was held September this year. And my first question has to do with your opinion about how hopeful is all those the venues you mentioned, not only the future the Summit of Future at the United Nations, but also other efforts you mentioned in your presentation. The second question has to do with the very dangerous situation in which North Korea, sends its troops to Ukraine. As we all know, we have two geostrategic fault lines in the world: the Western geostrategic fault line and the Eastern geostrategic fault line. Just like in geology, the two power blocks, United States and NATO on the one hand, and China and Russia on the other, these two places or power blocks collide. And then, as we see in geology, there are volcanoes and earthquake. In this case, in geostrategic situation, we have wars or conflict. We see a war in Ukraine. We see a war in the Middle East, and the Korean Peninsula is has been regarded as always a tinderbox, because we occupy the very dangerous geostrategic fault line, South China Sea and Taiwan Strait. So until now, there has been separation between two geostrategic fault lines, but North Korea decided to send its troops to Ukraine, which means connecting the two separate geostrategic fault lines. In worst case, it possibly means a global war. So these are the questions we are, really seriously interested in, because those are very pressing issues among South Koreans these days. So is there any, what is your assessment and what is your, interpretation and also policy implications, if any, countries, including South Korea and the United States and Russia and Ukraine, whatever, those countries are involved in making policies in an effort to explore, pathways to global peace. Thank you.
Thank you for those questions. And blimey, you must be tired of me. Sorry for going on. I think you're right, that it's not just South Korea that's caught between the liberal international order and the authoritarian international order. I mean, we in Britain and Europe are too, and I'm sure many other peoples and countries feel the same way. I mean, I wasn't fully on board for the liberal international order. I thought it was too American-dominated, too neoliberal, not enough focus on rights, was producing a lot of knowledge on rights, development, sustainability, and so on, but refused to implement it or pretended to implement it. And I think it's that level of hypocrisy that's undermined the legitimacy of this order. And if you bring that down to the ground and think about peace processes, for example, in Northern Ireland, we see a peace process that was very strongly implemented in which there were enormous redistribution and rebuilding between the communities to undermine and to move away from sectarianism, which has been pretty successful. They survived Brexit, even in Northern Ireland. But in many other peace processes, I mean, thinking about, for example, the Balkans with the Dayton peace process, we had constitutional agreements and we had military agreements, but when it came to dealing with social and economic issues, very little was done. And those countries have languished in a stalemated situation, which is now extremely tense, and notably is allowing Russia and Putin an entry point back into the Balkans. So when a peace process, is holistic and comprehensive and fully supported, it can work well, as in Northern Ireland with the EU guarantee, with American backing and enormous investment to reduce inequality. When it just has great power backing, but not much else going on, as in Bosnia-Herzegovina with the Dayton Agreement, it tends to get very stuck. Those stalemated peace processes create a vacuum. And I think many of us feel like we're in a similar vacuum too. So I wasn't fully on board for the LIO, and I'm certainly not on board for the AIO. I mean, I value my rights, mobility, contact, the opportunities, skills, the discoveries we can make, and so on are very important for civil society, social movements, academia, policymakers, all around the world. The alternative is rather totalitarian, I'm afraid, as we have seen. So the Summit of the Future was interesting because it was beginning to make this explicit. We saw in the early part of the war on Ukraine some very concerted General Assembly resolutions against Russia, huge numbers voting against Russia in the General Assembly. We saw that support wane recently, and it's been difficult to get General Assembly resolutions through, not because the West wouldn't win them, but because the numbers would be lower. But at the Summit of the Future, we also saw a great deal of energy and interest and dynamism around this question of what next. It is a very contested area, and all of a sudden there's a lot of things to fight for. What's happening, though, on the other side of the equation, for example, with North Korean troops in Ukraine and the growth of proxy wars, is the risk that all of these conflicts which are now flaring up, these stalemated peace processes which are eroding into more open hostilities around the world, they are all the unsolved legacies of the colonial world order and then the liberal world order, the American-backed liberal world order of the 20th century. And not having solved them in the time that we had available to us meant and means today that they could well escalate. So we're not just talking about backsliding, but we're talking about reversion to conflict. If these proxy wars join up, then we have a major conflict on our hands. I don't see that happening myself. I mean, I think there's too much entanglement and relationality and mobility. This transactional international order that we see from, for example, wannabe President Trump, and from the Russians and the Chinese and a few others too, I think works for elites, mainly economic elites, but doesn't work for many of the rest of us. So it will rapidly lead to kind of revolutionary challenges, revolutionary situations. And the historic way out of these tensions throughout history, going all the way back to Mesopotamia, has always been peacemaking. Peacemaking has evolved historically to deal with new types of conflicts. War is always evolving, violence is always evolving, but so is peacemaking. So I think we may have reached a point where, as we saw with the Summit of the Future, with R2P, the idea that you could do peacemaking before a conflict, before a war broke out, actually has some substance. So we have so many checks and balances dampening entanglements and relationships, which mean that large-scale wars are very difficult to justify, if not unthinkable, because they're entangled with so many other complexes, questions of justice and society, the environment and environmental degradation, the economy, and shared resources, the biosphere. So we're much more self-aware than we were in 1918, 1914, 1939, 1945, and so on and so forth. Intellectually, I think it's impossible to imagine a war like World War II again, but we can see these connected proxy wars blowing up in one area, dying out, blowing up in another area, dying out, if you like flares on the international stage, rather than a large-scale global set of hostilities. This is why I think that the authoritarian international order doesn't really have much viability. And I think as it crystallizes in our minds, when we see, for example, North Korea and Putin operating together in Ukraine, and we see the violation of life that's happening in that context, and how easily we could have got around that just by simply implementing the Minsk agreements and improving them, a discursive framework rather than a violent framework for politics. I don't see many buyers for that type of politics on the international stage. Just one caveat to this. Internally, the global north and the west are very divided. And those internal divisions are as dangerous as these proxy wars. We're dealing with global challenges in a complex world. The international peace architecture that we have is out of date. It's anachronistic. It's not obsolescent, but it is anachronistic. The authoritarian international orders, peace tools, are obsolescent already. So we're fighting new wars with old tools, and we need to reverse that proposition. We need to fight these new wars with even newer tools, which demands a lot of work.
Oh, thank you, Oliver. The time is up, but I personally thought, what would President Kim Dae-jung say about this very dangerous situation on the Korean Peninsula and the globe in terms of fighting a war in Ukraine and also in the Middle East and other areas as well? He must have been said this way. The government leaders, political leaders, not only them, but also opinion leaders and the press and even ordinary people are not supposed to say anything or do anything or take action, any action to raise military tension in these areas, in these geostrategic fault lines, because we are occupying a very serious geostrategic fault line on the Korean Peninsula. And we are deploring, actually, to see any of the responsible stakeholders, not only South Korea, but also North Korea and other United States and Russia and China also. All these stakeholders have to find something to lower the tension, not only on the Korean Peninsula, but also in Ukraine, the Middle East, so that we could not see that the very dangerous linkage or connection between the two geostrategic fault lines. Thank you so much, and I appreciate your participation again, and this session has adjourned.
네, 올리버 리치몬드 교수님과 백학순 원장님께 다시 한번 큰
Thank you very much for our moderator and the speaker, Professor Oliver Richmond. Thank you very much.